Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. This is February 10th, 2023. This is our first video update on the legislative session from the Tennessee County Services Association. I'm David Connor, the Executive Director of TCSA. Glad you're here with us this afternoon. We've got some really exciting updates on things happening with the legislature, in particular this week when the governor presented his State of the State and his budget address. Some great news for county highway departments, which we'll get into in just a minute, but let's get going. What you see here on the screen is the PowerPoint slide from Commissioner Bryson's presentation of the budget to the finance committees on Tuesday. We're also going to have some links posted below to other sites on the state website, like here where you can see the governor's State of State address and its transcript. This is TDOT's website, including their Build With Us initiatives, where you can find out more information about the overall major transportation proposal that the governor is bringing forward this year. So jumping right in, this is about 3 or 4 weeks into the legislative session. They came back on the second Tuesday in January just to organize, select their leadership, and go forward. The end of that week, they had the inauguration for the governor. The following week, the House was out, the Senate was in just to organize committees. The week after that, which was last week, was the bill filing deadline. So we had about 1,500 bills filed in the House and Senate by the end of close of business on Thursday last week. Ran through a lot of those. Got to see many of you at the TCCA Governmental Affairs Committee meeting last Friday. And that was great to hear the discussion from you all about your thoughts and ideas about which of those bills we should support and oppose. We'll get into more specific legislation as the session goes on and bills make their way through the committees. But for right now, the main thing we have to talk about are some major budget proposals. So going to run through this kind of quickly. As I said, these slides and other things, you can find links to those in the comments below this video. So we'll just hit some highlights. Over the last 2 years, the state's seen about a surplus of over $9 billion, about $2.6 billion when they closed out FY22, and they're projecting about $6.3 billion in additional revenue when they close this year's budget. Sales tax collections have been just astronomical this year. Throughout much of the budget year, there were double-digit growth in state sales tax projections, and that's the big reason why we're seeing such a huge surplus there. The state's looking at investing that in a lot of different ways, including putting about $3.3 billion of that into transportation projects, and we'll get to that in a second. You can see here the overall budget is going to be slightly less this upcoming year than last year, mostly because of a reduction in federal funds. There's some more slides and information in here about what they expect the economy to do. The state's still taking a very conservative approach as to what they think they're going to see in revenue projections next year, just to guard against the possibility of a recession and a slowdown. What's also going to protect them, however, is that they're investing a significant amount of money, more than $1 billion of recurring revenue in non-recurring expenditures. So they're paying down some capital projects and other things like that aren't recurring. So if they see a significant drop off in sales tax or other revenue growth, the next budget year, they should be in good shape because so much of what they're spending this year is going to be going on non-recurring things, even though they expect the budget, the revenue to be recurring. So we talked about that as far as surpluses and projections and revenue. This is interesting here. This slide is something Commissioner Bryson talked about. From 2016 to 2021, the population of Tennessee grew by about 400,000 people. But if you can see this little orange line near the bottom, road miles stayed basically the same in terms of lane miles. So we got 400,000 more people on the road, creating a lot of this congestion you'll see on this slide. But we haven't seen expansion of our road network. So the governor is really proposing a significant investment to try to help get at this backlog of about $26 billion in needs to relieve congestion on our roadways. So they're proposing a $3 million deposit into what they're calling a transportation modernization fund. That's $750 million available for projects in each of the 4 highway department regions across the state. For you all from our county highway departments, you're familiar with those 4 regions, but it basically breaks up the state into to those quadrants, and they're going to spend $750 million of this in each one on covering projects. Then $300 million one-time additional investment into the state aid road program. County highway departments obviously know how important that is for new mayors and commissioners. You may not be as familiar with it, but the state aid road program, it's a network of roads that are county roads that our highway departments maintain, but they normally get about $21 million a year statewide that the Department of Transportation sends down to help with resurfacing and repaving those roads and taking care of them. So the governor is proposing a $300 million additional investment into that. We've looked at projections from Department of Transportation, and we think every county highway department would see at least $2 million in new funding there. Brett's had some conversations with them from Tennessee County Highway Officials Association about concerns that they may not be able to get this all spent right away. And TDOT recognizes that, so they realize if you're a smaller rural county without many contractors and you're getting $2.5 million in road funding, you may not be able to put that all to work in the next budget year. They expect you'll have that for a few years to work on. Like I said, we'll continue to see our regular investment in the state aid road program, but this $300 million is a one-time huge injection of additional funds to help county highway departments, and we're really excited about that and appreciate it. We urge you already, it's not too soon to start talking to your state legislators, your representatives and senators about what that money would mean and how it could be put to good use. I think this really reflects also on how good stewards our highway departments have been of these funds. When the state in the past has done some increased funding, around $50 million into that program, they saw it put to tremendous use and make a big difference in communities across the state. I think that's why they're now trusting us with a proposal for $300 million. On education, the state is looking to now transition, and this will be the first year of TISA, the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement funding formula. Last year, we finished out the final year of the BEP. Now we're going into TISA. If you remember, in the last year of the BEP, there was about $750 million that was recurring funding that was put into things like CTE investments, capital investments, other things that were one time. So that money was sitting there available so that when we transitioned into the TISA formula, the state was going to start with $750 million that could immediately be plugged into the increased funding in TISA. What the governor is proposing, in addition to that $750 million that will carry over, is putting another $350 million on top of that for a $1.1 billion increase in funding under TISA compared to the last year, the BEP funding formula. Of that $350 million, he has said that he proposes for $125 million of that to be earmarked for teacher salaries. That is something that was, although most of TISA is no longer a resource-based formula, so it's not funding positions, it's not funding things like that. They can earmark a portion of it to be spent specifically on teacher salaries, and they're proposing $125 million of that. We have not seen the details yet on the education funding proposal. There's a lot of different buckets under TISA. Some of it's base, some of it's weights, some of it's direct funding, and we'll have to wait and see exactly where some of the rest of this money is proposed to go. There's some other investments here in school safety and other items I encourage you to take a look at. This bottom one here, the $29.7 million for Tennessee School Safety Initiative, is for the Office of Homeland Security to have an officer in all 95 counties across the state to help prevent incidents of school violence. Skipping on down, there's going to be a huge proposed investment in our TCAT facilities, almost $1 billion. They're showing on this slide that many of those facilities were built in the 60s and 70s and need to be modernized. So you can see here there's a tremendous investment in both some new campus locations as well as updating some of our outdated campuses. And the presentation's got a map in there of where those locations would be if you're curious about which ones are in your community. There's a lot in here that the governor talked about in his State of the State about investing in Tennessee families, particularly with pregnant women. As far as healthcare and some expansions of teen care, you can find out more in here, but that doesn't really hit county functions, so we're going to move on past some of those items. There are some safety grants here, including like a new $10 million proposed grants for jails to establish evidence-based programming around mental health issues with the inmates in the jail. There's also some support for like another $30 million for law enforcement recruiting and retention grants. Some enhancements to the Violent Crime Intervention Fund, and a big $357 million investment in technology for the communications networks for first responders and law enforcement. There's a lot in here as well about investments in our state park system, 2 new lodges, 4 new parks, a lot of investment in some of our natural areas and forests to enhance those, as well as completing some trails. Some of those may be in your community. And the governor's also proposing to do a lot for cleaning up brownfields and contaminated sites across the state to help restore some of our environment. This includes about a $25 million for continuing cleanup at Oak Ridge, $40 million for some other kind of Superfund type of contaminated sites that could be available in grants for businesses to be able to rehabilitate those locations. So a lot about environment in here as well. Those are kind of the big items in the state budget. There are some tax cuts in here. There's a 3-month proposed holiday on sales tax on food and food ingredients, and there's some proposed reductions in the business tax for certain small businesses. So far in committees, when they have talked about these, they've said they're going to hold local governments harmless. So it's not going to it's either not going to cut our local sales tax or the state reimburses for the reduction. And likewise, they think when they reduce some and create some exemptions for small businesses under the business tax, that they'll try to reimburse local governments for any potential lost revenue there. Some other items they're looking at doing is making about a $250 million deposit in the rainy day fund, paying down some unfunded liability for post-employment health benefits, and also making some additional contributions into TCRS. You can see on just this slide, that's $800 million that are things where the state's kind of paying down some of its liabilities that they don't have to. This could be an area where we see the legislature dip into some of this if they want to pay for some additional legislative priorities, because the governor's proposed budget really is spending all but about $10 million of the anticipated revenue. So he's putting it to work. We may see the legislature move it in some different directions with other priorities. As I mentioned, a big proposal in here is that $3.3 billion of moving general funds over to the transportation fund. There's a lot in here, and I encourage you to take a look at TDOT's site about their Build With Us initiative. As I mentioned, the $300 million is one-time funding for county highway departments, but we're also very appreciative of some proposals in here that would protect highway funding from decreases in fuel taxes going forward. As you all know, as we've seen more fuel-efficient vehicles and more electric vehicles showing up on our Tennessee roads, obviously they don't pay as much or any fuel taxes. And so we've seen flat or declining fuel tax revenues in recent years. Under the Improve Act, there was an additional $100 registration fee placed on all electric vehicles to try to counteract some of the fact that those vehicles are not paying anything in the way of fuel taxes to help keep up with our roads. What the governor's proposing in this is to go to a $274 fuel tax or a registration fee on those vehicles to kind of make up for the fact that they're not paying any fuel taxes. Something that's great. We had a very well-received meeting with the Commissioner of Transportation earlier this year and made the argument that, hey, if this money is intended to replace lost fuel tax revenue, counties participate in fuel tax revenue. We get about 25% of it, and we really think that we need to be participating in this. The $100 fee that was implemented under the Improve Act went entirely to the Department of Transportation. None of it was shared with city or county government. So we've asked, and the administration has heard that and has included that as a part of their proposal, that they're going to apply the same distribution formula from the fuel taxes to these higher registration fees, so that as we see more and more electric vehicles or more plug-in hybrids on the road, when they're paying a higher registration fee to offset the gas tax that they're not paying, we'll participate in that in the same way as we do in fuel taxes. So those are two things that we think are just critical. We're very appreciative of the governor for making those proposals, and we encourage you to talk to your legislators about how important those are going forward. So, throwing a lot at you. We look forward to things continuing to build up in the committees at the legislature. We'll see more individual bills moving, and we can talk about those proposals in the weeks to come. But for now, this is some great information out there about what's happening with the state budget, how these proposals could affect the county government, and we really encourage you to take a look at that. When we get more information about how the funding in TISA is going to come down, we'll definitely try to have a meeting. We're also looking at holding an education committee meeting, possibly towards the end of next week if we've got some of that information. So look out for that. We tried to hold one earlier and had some problems with our communication, so I apologize, but we will try to get a meeting of that committee soon. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great weekend, and feel free to reach out to us if you've got questions about any of this. Thanks.